Ruth Carter, an elderly cleaning lady, was finishing her late shift at a small diner, quietly wiping down tables under the flickering neon lights, when she suddenly noticed a frail boy in a wheelchair sitting outside through the glass window. He was shivering under the cold, harsh rain, random and unforgiving. Without hesitation, she placed her rag down, hurried outside into the storm, gently brought the boy inside, offering him warmth and kindness that the outside world had cruelly denied. What Ruth didn't know was that from across the street, in the shadow of a parked Bentley, a powerful man was quietly watching it all. That man was the boy's biological father, and Ruth's simple act of kindness was about to change her life forever. The heavy rain poured down Lexington Street, and nightfall settled around the small diner, Sonny's Diner, where only a few customers remained, quietly sipping their coffee. In the corner of the diner, Ruth Carter, a 67-year-old black cleaning lady, was gently mopping the floor. Her thin, weathered hands worked the mop in steady motions, while her aged eyes, still sharp, remained focused on the task at hand. Her life had been a long struggle, filled with hardships. Her husband passed away young, and Ruth lived alone in a small apartment on a rundown street at the end of town. To her, every day was a quiet battle for survival. Suddenly, a strange sound made her glance up at the window. Amidst the cold rain, under the dim light of the street lamp, she saw a boy sitting in a wheelchair, shaking and completely alone. His small, frail hand gripped an old, tattered blanket, but it wasn't enough to shield him from the bone-chilling cold. His wide eyes searched around with fear and despair. Ruth's heart tightened. Without thinking much, she immediately set the mop down, hurriedly opened the door, and stepped out into the heavy rain, ignoring the sting of the cold on her fragile body. "Boy, what are you doing out here? Are you okay?" The boy startled, his clear blue eyes looking up at her warily. But when he saw the kindness in her gaze, he breathed out a sigh of relief. "My dad told me to wait here. He said he'd be back." Ruth looked around but saw no one. Her heart ached as she realized how long the boy had been out there in the cold. She gently rubbed his shoulder and spoke softly. "Come inside with me. You can't stay out here like this." The boy hesitated, but the fierce cold quickly overcame his reluctance. He nodded, and Ruth carefully pushed his wheelchair inside the diner. The warm light and heat from the diner's stove made him exhale in relief. Ruth gently placed a clean towel over his shoulders and wiped away the raindrops still clinging to his small face. "What's your name, son?" "Daniel," the boy answered in a whisper, his eyes still shyly looking down at the floor. "Daniel, wait here for a moment." Ruth went into the kitchen, quickly preparing a plate of toasted bread and a bowl of hot soup, placing them in front of Daniel with a tender, affectionate gaze. "Eat, son. You'll warm up soon." Daniel's eyes brightened as if he hadn't received such kindness in a long time. He shyly picked up a piece of bread and ate it eagerly. His blue eyes shimmered with deep appreciation. At that moment, a sharp voice suddenly broke the warm atmosphere. "What do you think you're doing with that child?" Ruth turned to see Karen Mitchell, a middle-aged wealthy woman, a regular at the diner, looking at her with obvious disdain. "I'm just helping this boy. He's cold and hungry." Karen narrowed her eyes, her lips curling into a sarcastic, irritated smile. "Helping? Or is it kidnapping? I've seen too many people like you, using pity to get what you want." Karen pulled out her phone and immediately dialed the police. Her voice was clear and cold. "There's been a child kidnapping at Sonny's Diner. The suspect is a black old woman." The atmosphere in the diner immediately became tense. Suspicious glances from a few remaining customers turned toward Ruth. Her old heart thudded painfully, and the hurt was evident in her eyes. But Ruth kept calm, staring back at Karen with a stern, determined gaze. "I've never done anything wrong in my life, Mrs. Mitchell. Kindness is not something evil as you think." Daniel looked up, his eyes wide with fear, and suddenly grabbed Ruth's hand, as if pleading for protection. No one had ever defended him like this before. At that moment, from across the street, cold eyes watched the entire scene unfold in the darkness. Raymond Holt, powerful man and Daniel's biological father, sat still in his luxurious car, silently observing the chaotic scene in the diner. His eyes gleamed with curiosity and suspicion. That fateful rainstorm didn't just soak the small street. It marked the beginning of a series of events that would change Ruth's life forever. From the sleek black Bentley parked discreetly across the street, Raymond Holt sat motionless, his sharp gaze never leaving the small diner immersed in tension. Through the hazy window, obscured by the rain, he observed every gesture, every expression of the unfamiliar old woman next to his son. His face was as cold as stone, but the steely eyes betrayed a flicker of curiosity, an indiscernible intrigue. Raymond had never believed in unconditional kindness. To him, kindness always came with a clear purpose, and the world was simply a chessboard, where the winner was the one who could control others the best. What was the old woman, this stranger with a scarf wrapped around her head, her frail shoulders trembling, seeking from Daniel, from him? The sudden ring of his phone broke the silence in the car. Raymond furrowed his brow, but his eyes never left Ruth's figure inside the diner. With a practiced motion, he answered the call. "Mr. Holt, would you like me to intervene?" The sharp, calm voice of Nora Winters, his special assistant, came through. "Not yet," Raymond replied briefly, his voice calm but authoritative. "But I need you to look into that woman immediately, thoroughly. Leave no detail unchecked." "Understood. I'll take care of it right away." Raymond ended the call, placing the phone down as gently as if nothing were more important than maintaining his composure. But inside, questions continued to form, doubts growing stronger. Why would a poor, elderly woman, at an age when she should be resting, choose to help a complete stranger, a boy, in the cold of the night? He had never allowed emotions to cloud his decisions. As the CEO of Holt Dynamics, a massive conglomerate, Raymond was used to doubting everyone, always controlling everything around him. And to him, Daniel was not just a son. He was also the biggest vulnerability in the perfect life Raymond had meticulously built. Raymond remained silent for a few more minutes, then turned to Nora, his loyal assistant, always standing by to await orders. "Nora, don't miss anything about her. I need to know her circumstances, her past, her finances, and anything else we can use," he said, his voice calm yet cold. Nora nodded, understanding the task at hand. She opened her tablet, the light of the screen illuminating the sharp, cold expression of the professional assistant, someone accustomed to handling such matters with absolute speed and efficiency. Less than half an hour later, a preliminary report appeared on the tablet screen, reflecting in Raymond's eyes. He read each line carefully. Ruth Carter, 67 years old, widowed, living alone in a rundown apartment at the end of Maple Street. No children, no living relatives. Her limited income from part-time cleaning work at Sonny's Diner. A life of loneliness, poverty, no one to protect her, no one to defend her. Raymond's eyes flickered with a glimmer of satisfaction, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly as if he had just found a useful piece on the board. A woman like this, with such circumstances, was well within his control. Raymond Holt always knew one thing. A person with nothing would be easily manipulated, easily bought with what they had never had. "Perfect," he muttered softly, then tilted his head back to look at the diner. Through the rain-smeared window, he saw Ruth still gently comforting Daniel, trying to reassure the boy amid whispers of accusation. Raymond didn't believe in kindness, but he believed in opportunity, and this was the opportunity he needed. He leaned back in his seat, a little more relaxed, though still as cold as ever. Nora, prepare a meeting. I will speak with her myself. Nora was slightly surprised, but quickly regained her professional composure, nodding in confirmation. Understood, Mr. Holt. Raymond closed his eyes, his mind already visualizing the upcoming meeting. That woman was about to be drawn into a much bigger game than she imagined, and Raymond Holt, like always, would be the one in control. Outside, the rain continued to fall, sweeping away untold secrets, but Raymond knew one thing for certain. This rainstorm would mark the beginning of a long story, the story of power, kindness, and his absolute control. The persistent rain finally subsided, leaving small puddles on Maple Street that reflected the lonely yellow glow of the streetlights. It was nearly midnight, and the silence was unusually deep, broken only by the soft patter of raindrops still falling from the eaves. From the window of her small apartment on the second floor, Ruth Carter had just taken off her old coat and wearily sat down in the worn-out chair in the corner of the living room. She gazed at her calloused, wrinkled hands, letting out a soft sigh. Tonight had been a long night for her, a night filled with gossip, misunderstandings, and a lingering sadness deep within her. Just as she was about to get up to make a hot cup of tea to chase away the cold that had crept into her heart, the doorbell rang suddenly, shattering the stillness. Ruth furrowed her brow and glanced at the clock. It was too late. Who could be coming at this hour? With a wary look in her eyes, she walked to the door, opened it cautiously, and was surprised to find who stood before her. There, in the doorway, stood Raymond Holt. Tall, imposing, dressed in a long black coat, the collar turned up to give him an air of power. His gaze was calm and steady, as if he had every right to appear wherever he pleased. "Good evening, Mrs. Carter." His deep voice came with quiet authority, just loud enough to be heard. "We need to talk." Ruth froze for a moment, hesitant, but finally she opened the door wider, nodding cautiously. "Please, come in, Mr. Holt." Raymond stepped into the small apartment, his eyes quickly scanning the modest, humble living space. An old table, a few wooden chairs, and faded photographs told the story of a life full of hardship and loneliness. Ruth gestured for him to sit in the chair across from her. Raymond sat slowly, maintaining his usual perfect posture, exuding the authority of a man accustomed to controlling every situation. "I'm here because of Daniel," Raymond began, his gaze showing no emotion. "But also because of you." "Because of me?" Ruth asked, a mix of suspicion and curiosity in her voice. Raymond nodded, leaning slightly back as if dealing with a familiar task at the office. "Holt Dynamics is facing a major scandal. I need a positive image to balance public opinion. The events at Sonny's Diner tonight have spread widely, and you've been mentioned as a hero for helping my son." He stared straight into her eyes, his voice now more of an order than a request. "I want you to work for my company for a while. A simple job, high pay, and all you need to do is appear and prove that Holt Dynamics is not as cold-hearted as people say." Ruth fell silent for a moment, trying to process the cold, calculating words of the man before her. She looked at him with her old eyes, still clear and filled with an unshakable sense of dignity. "Mr. Holt, I helped Daniel not for money or fame. I did it because he needed help, that's all." Raymond smiled lightly, but there was no warmth in it. Only the cold patience of someone used to negotiating. I know what you're thinking, but you also know that someone in your situation doesn't get opportunities like this often. You've lived long enough to know that sometimes kindness needs to be reciprocated. He glanced around again, as if to emphasize Ruth's current life of scarcity. You have nothing to lose, do you? Ruth furrowed her brow, a deep sadness rising within her heart. This man, Raymond Holt, was nothing like anyone she had ever encountered. He controlled everything with absolute coldness, using power and money to force others into choices they couldn't refuse. But the image of Daniel shivering in the cold rain flashed in her mind again. The innocent boy needed help, needed someone to protect him from the indifference of his father. After a moment of silence, Ruth sighed and reluctantly nodded, her voice calm but firm. I agree, but you should remember this. I cannot be easily bought. I don't care about your money or the power you hold. I'm doing this for Daniel, and I will always do what I believe is right. Raymond smiled, this time his eyes showing a hint of surprise, but he quickly regained his usual composure. He stood up, adjusted his coat, and looked at Ruth with confident assurance. Very well, Mrs. Carter. I like people who are clear like you, but you should also remember, no one is completely immune to the temptations of money and power. Raymond gently placed his business card on the old table, turned, and walked toward the door. His figure gradually disappeared down the stairs, but his words echoed in Ruth's mind, reminding her that she had stepped into a game where power always held the upper hand. The door closed gently, returning the small apartment to its cold silence. Ruth sighed, looking at the business card on the table with eyes that were both resolute and anxious. She knew she had just entered the greatest challenge of her life, a challenge from which there would be no turning back, because behind it lay Daniel's future. The first morning at Holt Dynamics began earlier than usual. As the first rays of sunlight streamed through the large glass windows of the skyscraper, Ruth Carter was already there, mop in hand, standing in the middle of the polished marble hallway. She glanced around briefly, feeling a sense of loneliness that was hard to put into words. This place was a far cry from the cozy diner she had worked at for so many years. Senior employees started to pass by her, each step exuding confidence. Ruth could clearly feel their stares, disdainful, judgmental, and full of suspicion. It seemed that the presence of an elderly janitor like her in this luxurious environment was something out of place, a misfit. She tried to maintain her composure, focusing on cleaning the CEO's office. Raymond Holt. Every movement was deliberate, but no matter how hard she tried, the whispers around her never ceased. I don't know what Mr. Holt was thinking bringing that old woman here, a low female voice sneered. Probably trying to make some PR stunt fooling everyone, another voice responded sarcastically. Ruth swallowed the harsh words, reminding herself why she had accepted this job. She was here for Daniel, and only for him. At that moment, the elevator doors opened, and the sound of high heels echoed with power down the hallway. Karen Mitchell appeared, her carefully groomed blonde hair, expensive business attire, and piercing eyes that seemed to see right through everyone. She slowly walked toward Ruth, stopping right in front of her, her expression dripping with contempt. Oh, look who it is. It's Mrs. Carter, the diner hero, here to clean our offices. How touching, she mocked. Snickers and laughter rippled around the hallway, making the atmosphere even more suffocating. Ruth looked up, meeting Karen's gaze with calm eyes, unwavering but unyielding. I'm here to do my job, Mrs. Mitchell. I'd appreciate it if you respected that. Karen raised an eyebrow, crossed her arms in front of her chest, and let out a cold laugh. Respect? Are you sure you understand what that word means? This isn't a place for people like you. You'd be better off going back to that little diner where you belong." Ruth stood tall, her eyes still calm but her voice stronger, clearer with each word. "People like me? Mrs. Mitchell, I'm not sure what you're implying, but I know one thing for sure. No matter how powerful or wealthy you are, that doesn't give you the right to disrespect others." The air instantly thickened with tension. The employees standing around fell silent, their curious eyes fixed on the sudden confrontation. Karen flinched slightly at the older woman's firm response, which was completely unlike the weak person she had imagined Ruth to be. But within a second, Karen regained her composure, taking a step closer, closing the distance between them. Her voice dropped, but it was filled with threatening pressure. "Listen carefully, Mrs. Carter. This is Holt Dynamics, not some diner where you can play the hero. Here, everything runs according to its own order, and if you can't learn to accept that, you won't last a single day." Karen turned and walked away, leaving Ruth standing in the hallway, surrounded by the heavy silence of curious gazes. Ruth bit her lip, swallowing the sting of humiliation and anger, but her heart remained lifted with pride. Just then, the door to the large office swung open. Raymond Holt stepped out, his cold eyes scanning the crowd gathered around Ruth. "What's going on here?" His voice was authoritative, and the employees immediately dispersed. His gaze lingered for a moment on Karen, then shifted to Ruth, his face showing no emotion. "Mrs. Carter, I need my office cleaned before the meeting. Focus on your work," he coldly reminded her, before turning and slamming the office door shut. Ruth took a deep breath, trying to hold on to the little calm she had left. She knew that the battle she had just entered would not be an easy one, and Karen Mitchell would not stop here. But Ruth couldn't give up, at least not now, not while Daniel still needed her. She picked up the mop once more, resuming the work she had started. Her hands trembled slightly, but her gaze remained determined. She had entered the lion's den, and she would fight to the end, even if it meant facing the coldest and most powerful adversaries. The first days at Holt Dynamics were never easy for Ruth Carter. After the tense confrontation with Karen Mitchell, she clearly realized she was not welcome there. But she persevered in her work, hoping that hard work and sincerity would help her overcome the prejudices and scrutinizing looks from the senior staff. One weekend afternoon, after all the office staff had left for the day, Ruth was assigned a special task: to clean the executive offices, a private and highly important area located on the top floor of the building. The office was large and luxurious, with high-end furniture, expensive oak desks, and large windows stretching from floor to ceiling. Ruth stood there, took a deep breath, and carefully began her task. As she was cleaning the large desk, her gaze accidentally fell on a black folder lying open at the edge of the desk. The pages, filled with numbers and complex charts, made her furrow her brow, and she quickly stepped back. Ruth knew that such documents were highly confidential, and she had no right to read or touch them. She immediately closed the folder gently and continued her cleaning without paying any more attention to it. Less than 5 minutes later, the office phone suddenly rang. Ruth hesitated for a moment before gently picking up the receiver, her voice soft and polite. "Executive office, this is Ruth Carter." A woman's cold, authoritative voice came through the line. "Mrs. Carter, Mr. Holt wants you to immediately bring the black folder from the desk to the meeting room on the 5th floor. Hurry, he's waiting." Ruth was slightly confused, but quickly responded. "Yes, I'll bring it right down." She gently picked up the folder she had just closed and walked out of the office, heading straight for the elevator, unaware that she was stepping into a carefully laid trap. Arriving on the 5th floor, Ruth opened the meeting room door as instructed, but the room was empty. No one was waiting for her. In that brief moment, she felt something wasn't right. Before she could process it, a familiar voice called out from behind her. "Mrs. Carter, what are you doing here?" Ruth turned around, startled to see Karen Mitchell standing at the door, with Raymond Holt and several other senior employees behind her. Karen's eyes were smug, her lips twisted into a malicious smile. Raymond, however, looked at her with an unreadable expression, his cold gray eyes showing no emotion. I was told to bring this document to Mr. Holt," Ruth replied, her voice trembling with anxiety. Karen stepped forward, glaring at the folder in Ruth's hands, her eyebrows raised in mockery. "Really? But as far as I know, this is highly confidential material about the company's upcoming financial plans. Where exactly are you taking it?" "I told you I received a phone call instructing me to bring it here," Ruth insisted, trying to stay calm. Karen let out a soft laugh and turned to Raymond with a feigned, worried look. "Mr. Holt, I think we should check if any information has been leaked. No one knows what Mrs. Carter intends to do with this document." Raymond walked toward Ruth, taking the folder from her hands and quickly flipping through its pages, his expression still unreadable. Finally, he looked up, meeting Ruth's gaze, his voice calm but with an underlying pressure. "Who called you, Mrs. Carter?" "I'm not sure. It was a woman's voice. She told me to bring the document down here to you." Ruth answered honestly, but she knew that what she was saying now sounded fragile. Karen immediately interrupted, not giving Ruth a chance to explain further. "Clearly, this is intentional. Mrs. Carter may have taken a photo or leaked the information already. We can't trust people like her in this company." Raymond furrowed his brow and looked at Ruth with a sterner gaze. "Mrs. Carter, do you understand the gravity of this? If this information gets out, the consequences will be severe." The atmosphere in the meeting room was now unbearably tense. All eyes were on Ruth, waiting for her response or confession. She felt an immense pressure, but the nearly 70 years of life experience told her that this was clearly a setup designed to bring her down. Ruth took a deep breath, regained her composure, and began to defend herself resolutely. "Mr. Holt, I don't know enough about the work here to understand the value of this document, nor do I have the ability to leak it. If you truly want to investigate, check the internal phone system to see who called the CEO's office when I was there. Also, you can review the security cameras to see that I was only following the instructions from that call." Ruth's calm and sharp suggestion momentarily threw Karen off balance. Raymond's face showed the first signs of surprise. He immediately turned to order his assistant, Nora Winters. "Nora, check the internal call history and security cameras right now." Karen tried to hide her anxiety, but Ruth could see the tension in her eyes. Ruth knew she had just hit the weak spot of whoever had set up this trap. Raymond turned back to look at Ruth once more, and for the first time, his gaze carried a spark of curiosity and a completely different kind of evaluation. Ruth stood tall, her gaze unwavering, silently telling herself that she would not easily succumb to any injustice, even if the person standing before her wielded immense power. After the tense confrontation over the leaked confidential information, the atmosphere around Ruth at Holt Dynamics grew heavier than ever. Despite having proven her innocence, the looks of those around her remained filled with suspicion and wariness. But that no longer mattered. Ruth only needed to keep her conscience clear and continue her work for the quiet promise she had made to Daniel. One late afternoon, when most employees had already left, Ruth quietly packed up her cleaning supplies to prepare to leave. The executive floor was now only filled with the distant footsteps of a few security guards patrolling. As she was about to turn to leave, she suddenly heard soft voices coming from the slightly ajar door of Raymond Holt's office. Ruth hesitated. She was about to walk away, but something inside her told her that the conversation in that room was unusual. The familiar voice of Nora Winters was cold and clear. "Mr. Holt, the downsizing plan will be implemented next Monday. Based on the calculations, we'll be laying off about 3,000 employees, most of them from the production and customer service departments. This will help Holt Dynamics cut nearly 20% of operational costs and push the stock price up sharply in the next quarter." Raymond remained silent for a moment, and Ruth felt as though her heart had stopped beating as she waited for his response. Finally, Raymond's voice echoed, low and calm, as though he were speaking about an obvious, emotionless fact. "Good, Nora. These people are no longer useful for our new strategy. The company needs to prioritize profit and shareholders over the feelings of low-level employees." His words struck Ruth like a cold wind through her heart. 3,000 people, 3,000 families were about to lose their jobs, their livelihoods. How could he say it so matter-of-factly? Ruth stood there, trying to suppress the rising anger within her. She had lived through hard times and had witnessed families torn apart because they lost a stable source of income. She understood more than anyone the pain of ordinary workers, the very people who would bear the heavy consequences of this ruthless and cold-hearted decision. Unable to bear it any longer, Ruth decided she had to do something, and she had to do it now. She took a deep breath, gathered her courage, and knocked gently on the door of Raymond's office. "Come in," Raymond's voice rang out, without suspicion. Ruth entered, standing straight in front of Raymond and Nora. Her unexpected presence surprised both of them, especially Nora, whose sharp eyes narrowed in caution. "Miss Carter, is there something you need?" Raymond spoke first, his tone cold, but still maintaining his usual polite demeanor. Ruth stared directly into Raymond's eyes, her voice trembling slightly with emotion, but resolute. "I just overheard your conversation with Ms. Winters. I can't stay silent knowing you plan to lay off 3,000 people. 3,000 families will be out of work. Mr. Holt, do you really think that profit and stock prices are more important than the lives of those people?" Raymond furrowed his brow, his face briefly showing displeasure at Ruth's intrusion. However, he maintained his calm and explained slowly, as though teaching a child who didn't understand the world. "Miss Carter, I understand your concern, but this is a business decision, not a matter of personal ethics. In this world, sometimes leaders must sacrifice small benefits for the greater good of the corporation. That's the survival principle." Ruth shook her head forcefully, her eyes sparkling with emotion but unwavering as she met Raymond's cold gaze. "Sacrifice, Mr. Holt? These workers have given their youth, their strength, and their lives to this company. You say they're no longer useful? Since when did people become disposable goods to be thrown away so easily?" Her voice choked for a moment, but Ruth continued, "I've lived my whole life in poverty, and I know exactly what it means to lose a stable income. It's not just a number on your financial report, it's food on the table, clothes to wear, money for children's medicine, and peaceful sleep every night. Mr. Holt, you have the power to lay them off, but you will never fully understand the consequences of what you're doing." The office fell into a heavy silence. Raymond looked at Ruth closely, and for the first time, he saw the resilience and strength hidden within this elderly woman. He knew he could end the conversation right there, but some strange feeling compelled him to let her speak. Finally, Nora interjected, her voice sharp, trying to defend her superior's decision. "Ms. Carter, you don't understand the complexities of modern business. This corporation must survive at all costs. and sometimes that means making tough decisions. Ruth turned to Nora, her voice firm. I may not understand the numbers or your complex business strategies, but I understand one thing very clearly. No company can last long if it's willing to discard human values just to increase profits. Ruth looked at Raymond one last time before leaving the room, her eyes filled with determination and deep disappointment. Mr. Holt, you may be the most powerful person here, but if you lose your heart and conscience one day, you'll have nothing left to protect. She stepped out, closing the door behind her, leaving Raymond sitting still, lost in complicated thoughts. Never before had a debate with an ordinary worker like her made him think so deeply. And for the first time, in his cold heart, a small crack silently appeared. The office door closed behind Ruth, but the words she had just spoken echoed heavily in Raymond Holt's mind. For many years, he had been used to making cold decisions, completely detached from personal emotions. But this time there was something different, something that made him unable to deny the power of the words Ruth had spoken. In the days that followed, rumors about the plan to lay off thousands of employees at Holt Dynamics began to spread rapidly within the company, creating a tense atmosphere on all floors. Employees began to murmur, worried about the uncertain future ahead. The management immediately called for an emergency meeting to address the growing negative rumors. The meeting took place on Friday morning, in the large, lavishly designed boardroom on the top floor of Holt Dynamics. The board members were all present, their serious faces and wary eyes directed toward the door. Raymond sat at the head of the table, maintaining his usual calm demeanor, but inside, a discomfort unlike any he had felt before was rising. Suddenly, the door to the meeting room swung open, and none other than Ruth Carter, the janitor whom everyone had been talking about, walked in. She entered to the stunned gazes of the most powerful people in the company, her face calm but resolute. One of the board members, William Dawson, spoke up first, his tone confused. Ms. Carter, this meeting is only for senior leadership. I don't understand why you're here. Before Ruth could respond, Raymond stood up, his gaze cold but his voice calm, almost eerily so. I invited Ms. Carter here. I believe the board needs to hear another perspective on the decision we're about to make. The atmosphere in the room immediately became more stifling than ever. The board members exchanged skeptical glances, but no one dared oppose Raymond's words. Ruth stepped forward, standing tall before the board, her eyes direct and unwavering. Ladies and gentlemen, I stand here today not as a small janitor from Holt Dynamics. I stand here representing the thousands of employees who are fearful for their future, people who have devoted themselves to this company for many years. Ruth began in a strong and clear voice. Karen Mitchell, who had long held disdain and contempt for Ruth, immediately interjected, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Ms. Carter, we appreciate your opinion, but do you really think you're capable of understanding the complex issues of a corporation like Holt Dynamics? Ruth turned to Karen, her gaze unwavering. Ms. Mitchell, you're right. I don't understand the numbers on financial reports, and I'm not an expert in business strategy. But I understand something that seems to be deliberately forgotten by everyone here. A successful company must be built on loyalty, trust, and respect for people, not by sacrificing thousands of families just to increase profits by a few percentage points. Raymond cut in, his voice sharp but controlled. Ms. Carter, I've already explained to you that this is a business decision. If Holt Dynamics doesn't take these measures, we will lose our competitive edge in the market. Do you really think we make this decision lightly? Ruth looked Raymond directly in the eye, her voice now stronger than ever. Mr. Holt, I understand that the world isn't simple. I also understand that sometimes leaders have to make painful decisions, but ask yourself once more, is this really the only way? Is the short-term profit you're pursuing truly worth the long-term pain that thousands of families will have to endure? Several board members exchanged looks of concern. For the first time, they saw a regular janitor stand confidently and persuasively before the most powerful people in the company. Raymond remained silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on Ruth. He was trying to understand what force allowed this small, elderly woman to stand firm against the immense pressure from the most powerful people in the company. He knew she had no ulterior motive. She was doing all this for fairness and her own conscience. Karen, sensing the wavering in the board's stance, immediately stood up, trying to undermine Ruth's argument. Please, everyone, let's not let emotions cloud our judgment. We cannot run a company based on pity. Weakness will only lead Holt Dynamics to failure. Ruth turned to Karen, her response calm but firm. Ms. Mitchell, do you think compassion is weakness? I believe the true strength of a company lies in its ability to protect its people, not discard them when they're no longer useful. What would Holt Dynamics become if tomorrow all the most loyal employees left, realizing that the company doesn't care about them? The room fell into a deeper silence. The board members began to reflect seriously on Ruth's words. Even Raymond, for the first time in his leadership, felt the extraordinary power in the soul of this frail, elderly woman who appeared so weak. Raymond slowly stood up, looking around the boardroom, then stopping at Ruth. His voice dropped, clear and deliberate. I think we need more time to carefully consider this decision. Today's meeting is adjourned. The door to the meeting room opened, and the members silently left. Raymond stayed behind, silently watching Ruth one last time. In that moment, he understood that from now on, he would never again underestimate the power of courage and trust. The very things Ruth Carter had boldly brought into a world that was often cold and indifferent. The meeting had just ended, but the lingering echoes of Ruth Carter's heartfelt words continued to haunt Raymond Holt. He had never felt so powerless before, especially in front of an elderly, small woman who held no real power in her hands. Raymond sat alone in the empty meeting room, his gaze distant as he looked out the large glass window, reflecting on every word Ruth had said, words that were so honest they made him uncomfortable and left him questioning himself. Meanwhile, Ruth returned to her daily tasks. She silently cleaned the hallways and offices, her heart heavy with mixed emotions. She didn't regret speaking the truths she had shared, but inside, a great emptiness filled her heart, an emptiness full of anxiety and sadness. She wondered if what she had done would truly change anything, or if it was simply a weak voice against the immense power that ruled over Holt Dynamics. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the company grew more oppressive than ever. Employees whispered about Ruth, about her confrontation with the board. Some looked at her with deep admiration, while others kept their distance, avoiding her as if she had touched something forbidden. Karen Mitchell, cold and ruthless by nature, was not one to easily forgive. For her, Ruth's presence and strong words were a challenge to the power she couldn't tolerate. Karen immediately began spreading malicious rumors, claiming that Ruth was intentionally trying to sabotage Holt Dynamics from within. She described Ruth as an extremist, exploiting emotions to weaken the decisions of the leadership. The vicious rumors spread like toxic waves, gradually making Ruth feel suffocated every time she stepped into the building. She bitterly realized that the environment here would never change. That feeling made her think more and more about an important decision, a decision she knew would not be easy given her current circumstances. One weekend afternoon, when most of the staff had already left, Ruth quietly walked to Raymond Holt's office. She had prepared her resignation letter, her heart full of emotion yet determined. Raymond looked up as she entered, a brief look of surprise crossing his face before his usual calm demeanor returned. "Miss Carter, what brings you here?" Ruth approached his desk and gently placed the resignation letter on the table. Her gaze was gentle but firm. "Mr. Holt, I've come to submit my resignation. I can't continue working here any longer." Raymond paused for a moment. His eyes focused on the letter on the table, his voice low and almost sincere. "You don't have to do this, Miss Carter. Your words in the meeting earlier have made me think a lot. We may have differing viewpoints, but I respect your opinion and your courage." Ruth smiled faintly, her voice full of self-respect. "I know you're trying to say something kind, Mr. Holt, but the issue isn't about you or me. It's about the environment here, a place I can no longer accept. I don't want to work at a place where power and profit are more important than human lives. My conscience won't allow that." Raymond was silent, taken aback by her straightforward and powerful words. For the first time, he felt unable to counter even a single word. A part of him felt ashamed, but he quickly masked that emotion, his voice softening. "I understand. If this is your final decision, I will respect it. Holt Dynamics will take care of all the formalities so you can receive your deserved benefits upon leaving." Ruth shook her head gently. "I don't need anything more from Holt Dynamics. I just want to leave with peace in my heart. I hope, Mr. Holt, that you'll carefully consider your decision to fire those employees, as every decision you make affects many lives outside these walls." She turned to leave, pausing for a final moment to look at Raymond with a stern gaze. "You can build a powerful corporation, Mr. Holt, but without a heart and compassion, you won't be able to build anything truly meaningful." Ruth walked out of Raymond's office, feeling an unusual sense of relief. She knew the days ahead would be extremely difficult without her sole source of income, but she also understood that she had just made the most right decision of her life. A decision based on conscience and self-respect that no amount of money could ever buy. News of Ruth's resignation quickly spread, causing a strong public outcry. The media and press immediately questioned the working environment at Holt Dynamics. Articles about the elderly cleaning lady standing up for workers spread rapidly, creating a strong wave of opposition aimed directly at Raymond Holt's corporation. Employees began speaking out, sharing stories of Ruth's kindness and sincerity, and for the first time, Holt Dynamics had to face a serious media crisis. Ruth's image, the elderly woman full of courage, was widely circulated by the media, forcing the city to question the business ethics and social responsibility of this renowned corporation. Meanwhile, Raymond Holt, for the first time in many years of leadership, felt a noticeable shift in his own internal world. Ruth's departure left not only a void in the company, but also a huge question mark that he couldn't easily dismiss. A question about the true meaning of power and conscience, something he had long thought he had lost. The public wave grew ever wider after Ruth Carter left Holt Dynamics, like a small stone dropped into a calm lake, creating ripples that spread farther and farther. Outraged questions from the public, critical articles in the media, and endless chatter on social media. Everything was directed at Raymond Holt and his powerful corporation. But what was even more surprising was the image of the elderly woman. Once considered weak, now becoming a living symbol of courage, integrity, and compassion. Amid the rising tension in the media, Ruth sat silently in her small, old apartment, gazing out the window at the familiar street below. Her mind was in turmoil about the uncertain future ahead. She knew she had just given up her only stable source of income, and that the difficult life ahead would only get harder. But deep in her heart, she felt no regret. She knew she had done the right thing. The phone rang suddenly, pulling Ruth out of her wandering thoughts. She picked up the receiver, her voice soft but tinged with exhaustion. "Hello, Ruth Carter speaking." There was a brief silence on the other end before a calm, clear, and polite male voice came through. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Carter. This is Richard Vaughn, CEO of Orion Group. I apologize if this call is disturbing you at such a sensitive time." Ruth was taken aback. Her heart skipped a beat. Orion Group was no stranger to her. It was one of the top corporations, a direct competitor to Holt Dynamics, known for its community support programs for struggling workers. "Mr. Vaughn, what can I do for you?" Ruth replied cautiously with a hint of curiosity. Richard Vaughn continued in a measured tone. "I've been following your story in the media, and I'm truly impressed by your courage and the actions you took at Holt Dynamics. I believe we could do something truly meaningful together." Ruth remained silent for a moment, a strange feeling stirring within her. No one had ever told her she could do something big. She had always thought her influence was limited to the small world life had set out for her. "What do you mean, Mr. Vaughn?" she asked, her voice filled with doubt and a flicker of hope. "I'm planning to launch a new social program at Orion Group to protect the rights, improve working conditions, and support the lives of the city's low-income workers," Vaughn explained, making sure each word was clear to Ruth. "And I think no one is more suited than you to be the representative and leader of this program." Ruth was stunned. This was a turning point she had never imagined in her life. A woman who had spent her life as a janitor, always living in disregard, was now being offered to become the central figure of a meaningful social project. "Mr. Vaughn, I don't know if I'm capable." Ruth hesitated, her voice trembling with emotion. Understanding her concerns, Richard Vaughn reassured her with a calm yet confident voice. "Mrs. Carter, the most important quality we need from you is heart and courage. This world is full of talented but indifferent people. I don't need another CEO who is good at calculating profits. I need someone like you, someone brave enough to stand up for what's right and defend the rights of the vulnerable." Ruth could hear each word clearly through the phone. Suddenly, she realized that this was the opportunity she had quietly been waiting for all her life. A real chance to stand up for people like her, small people who were all too familiar with deprivation and injustice. She took a deep breath, regained her composure, and spoke with determination. "Yes, Mr. Vaughn, I accept. I will join this program. I will do everything I can to ensure that the workers out there never have to endure what I've gone through." Richard Vaughn responded immediately, his voice full of genuine respect. "Wonderful, Mrs. Carter. Together, we will change the small world around us step by step." The news of Ruth Carter's collaboration with Orion Group quickly spread across the media, creating an unprecedented positive stir in the community. In stark contrast to the harsh criticism directed at Holt Dynamics, Orion Group received countless praises from both the media and the public. People began to realize that amidst a world of calculation and coldness, there were still people like Ruth and Richard Vaughn, those who were willing to place moral and human values above business interests. As for Raymond Holt, he watched this event unfold with a bitter and uncomfortable feeling like never before. The woman he had once thought easy to control and harmless was now standing alongside his biggest competitor, creating a wave strong enough to shake Holt Dynamics' position. Raymond realized that for the first time in his life, he was facing a real challenge, not one of profit or power, but one of conscience and core values. He sat quietly in his large office, for the first time seriously contemplating the question that Ruth had left in his heart. what good is power if the heart and ethics are lost? In her small, old apartment on the poor street, Ruth stood before the window, a gentle smile on her face. She understood that she had just entered a completely new chapter of her life, a chapter in which, for the first time, she had the right to write the most meaningful lines, not just for herself, but for the thousands of workers waiting for her out there. Ruth Carter's decision to collaborate with Richard Vaughn and the Orion Group quickly created a positive ripple effect beyond all expectations. Within just a few short weeks, her reputation had grown far beyond the small street corners or cold hallways of Holt Dynamics. Now, Ruth Carter's name had become a shining symbol in the media, representing compassion, courage, and the hidden strength of small individuals who always stand up for what is right. After several meetings and community engagements, the Orion Group's social project officially launched under a meaningful name: the Carter Community Foundation, a social fund named after Ruth Carter, embodying the spirit and values she had spent her life fighting for and protecting. The grand opening of the Carter Community Foundation was held right in the heart of the city, in a space that was once an old, abandoned factory. What had once been a symbol of the local economy's decay was now dramatically revitalized, becoming a training center, a community support hub, and a place providing free education for hundreds of struggling working-class families. The opening ceremony was attended by many local residents, media representatives, businesses, and even some politicians. On stage, Ruth stood beside Richard Vaughn, her eyes shining with a mixture of pride and deep emotion. For the first time in her life, Ruth felt that her quiet efforts and courage had truly changed reality. Below the stage, hundreds of eyes looked up with hopeful expressions. These were workers who had been laid off from factories, single mothers, and poor children who had never been able to attend school properly. Among the crowd, Ruth recognized familiar faces from her time at Sonny's Diner, even a few former employees from Holt Dynamics, people who had once lived in constant anxiety and fear of losing their jobs. She stepped forward to the microphone, her voice clear, sincere, and warm, touching the hearts of everyone present. Ladies and gentlemen, I once believed that my small voice could never make a big difference. I once believed that kindness and goodness were small, weak things, not enough to change this harsh world. But today, standing before all of you, I realize I was wrong. The truth is, each of us, no matter who we are, where we are, rich or poor, has the ability to change the world in our own way, as long as we never give up on hope and keep our hearts turned toward good. The applause that followed was long and unyielding. Ruth turned to Richard Vaughn, who stood beside her with deep respect and admiration. He stepped toward the microphone, his voice strong and firm. Orion Group commits that, together with Mrs. Ruth Carter, we will continue to invest in and expand the Carter Community Foundation. From today, this place will be a home for those seeking new opportunities, a home where anyone can walk in with dignity and walk out with true confidence and chances in life. Immediately after the grand opening, Carter Community Foundation's practical activities were quickly rolled out in an organized and effective manner. Free vocational training programs such as computer technician, sewing, cooking, and other career skills were held regularly each day. Educational support programs for poor children, providing scholarships and food assistance for struggling families, were also swiftly implemented, creating a wave of positive change across the community. In just a short period, hundreds of families found a new ray of hope. People continually spoke of Ruth Carter as a living symbol of kindness, a powerful testament that, no matter the circumstances, the strength of compassion is the most important thing each person must preserve. However, at Holt Dynamics, the atmosphere was completely different. Raymond Holt, who had once prided himself on running his corporation with cold calculation, now found himself bewildered by the rapidly growing influence of the Carter Community Foundation. He had never imagined that a cleaning lady who had once worked in his company could create such a far-reaching impact. Meanwhile, Karen Mitchell couldn't stop expressing her anger and jealousy toward Ruth's success. She did everything she could to hinder and weaken the activities of the Carter Community Foundation. Karen secretly approached some members of the community, spreading distorted information and trying to tarnish Ruth's image as an opportunist, exploiting kindness for personal gain. But all of Karen's negative efforts were quickly shut down by those who had directly benefited from the Carter Community Foundation. The living witnesses, those who had received real and sincere help from Ruth, didn't hesitate to speak out, clearly affirming the true meaning of the program. As a result, Ruth's credibility and influence were further strengthened. The media and public opinion became more supportive of her than ever before. Even those who had once been skeptical began to change their perspectives, believing in the power of kindness and compassion, things they had previously thought were outdated. That evening, in her small room, Ruth sat quietly, smiling peacefully. She knew that her journey had just begun, but at least she had made a real change in societal awareness, a change that she had dreamed of her entire life. Ruth knew that, from now on, she was no longer alone. She had built a true empire, an empire of kindness, where the value of humanity was always placed above all else. And she believed that from here on, the small world around her would truly change, day by day, hour by hour, through the quiet but powerful force of kindness. As the Carter Community Foundation continued to grow and spread positive waves throughout the community, across the city, in a vast and lavish mansion, Raymond Holt was living in an unprecedented solitude. In recent days, he had become increasingly withdrawn, less communicative, often lost in deep thought. Somewhere within him, the image of the elderly but resilient woman, Ruth Carter, haunted him endlessly, reminding him of the things he once considered small and unimportant, but which had now become profoundly significant. At the same time, one late afternoon at the new office of the Carter Community Foundation, Ruth was reviewing applications for scholarship programs when the office door suddenly opened softly. She looked up and froze when she saw a tall young man standing before her, his face familiar yet weary and contemplative. Ruth immediately recognized him. It was Daniel Holt, the boy she had once brought into the diner to shield from the cold, harsh rain. "Daniel, is that really you?" Ruth stood up, her eyes betraying a deep emotion. Daniel nodded gently, offering a faint smile and stepping closer. His voice was low but sincere. "Yes, it's me, Mrs. Ruth. I've grown up, but I've never forgotten the image of you that night, that fateful night." The two sat down and talked. Daniel shared with Ruth the years he had spent in the shadow of the cold, unfeeling power created by his father, Raymond Holt. Daniel held nothing back, speaking honestly, his voice filled with sorrow. "I know you had to endure a lot while working at Holt Dynamics, but that wasn't all. My father was not just cold with employees, he was the same with his own son. He always believed emotions were a weakness, and I was raised to be strong, emotionless, just like him." Daniel fell silent for a long moment, then continued in a trembling, emotional voice. "You know, even that night when you brought me into the diner, he was sitting right across the street in his car, watching me shiver in the rain without intervening. He wanted me to learn to face hardship on my own, even as a disabled, lonely, and weak boy." Daniel's words were like a knife to Ruth's heart. She was shaken, her heart aching as she realized the truth behind the power and fame Raymond Holt had built. She could not imagine how a father could be so cold and cruel to his own child. Daniel looked into Ruth's eyes, his gaze sincere and filled with hope. "Mrs. Ruth, I didn't come here just to tell you about my painful past. I came because I know you're the only one who can change my father. He may never listen to me, but maybe he'll listen to you. I believe there's still a sliver of conscience and compassion in him, though he's buried it for so long." Ruth sighed, gazing deeply into Daniel's sincere eyes. She could feel the loneliness and pain hidden in the heart of the young man, who had spent his life trying to live up to his father's expectations, but had never once been acknowledged by him. Finally, she gently placed her hand on Daniel's, her voice soft yet full of resolve. "Daniel, you were right to come to me. Perhaps I was wrong to think your father was completely heartless and incapable of change. I once believed in the goodness and kindness of everyone, and your father is no exception. Maybe he just needs a stronger push to awaken the heart he's kept dormant for so long." Daniel looked up at her, a spark of hope in his eyes. His voice was sincere. "Do you really think it's possible, Mrs. Ruth?" Ruth nodded, her eyes shining with determination. "I believe it is. Sometimes people simply forget how to feel and listen to their hearts. What they need is someone brave and persistent enough to awaken the goodness that lies dormant within them." That very night, Ruth decided to call Raymond Holt. On the other end of the line, Raymond was taken aback when he heard her familiar voice, though he tried to maintain his cold, calm tone. "Mrs. Carter, it's a surprise to hear from you." Ruth didn't hesitate, her voice clear and direct. "Mr. Holt, I need to meet with you. This won't be an easy conversation, but I think it's time we face the things you've been avoiding for many years." Raymond was silent for a moment before finally agreeing. "All right, Mrs. Carter, I'll meet you." When the call ended, Raymond sat alone in his large, cold office, his gaze drifting toward an old family photo on his desk. The image of Daniel, his son, whom he had kept at arm's length so sternly and harshly, suddenly made his heart ache. Meanwhile, in her small room, Ruth sat by the window, feeling each strong beat of her heart. She understood that she was about to face the most important confrontation of her life, not to defeat an opponent, but to confront the darkness in the heart of a powerful yet deeply lonely man. She closed her eyes, silently telling herself that no matter what happened, she would never give up. For she knew that this battle wasn't just about Raymond Holt or Daniel. It was about the unshakable belief in the ability of every person to change, no matter how long their hearts had been clouded by darkness. The meeting between Ruth and Raymond Holt took place on a late autumn afternoon, as the golden sunset slowly descended over the city. In a small cafe tucked away in a quiet corner of the park, Ruth sat waiting, her heart filled with mixed emotions. This wasn't the first time she'd faced Raymond, but never had she felt so tense. For this wasn't just a conversation between two people who had once clashed. It was a deep dialogue about the human heart and the mistakes of the past. Raymond arrived right on time, calm and composed as usual. But this time, there was no trace of the cold, arrogant demeanor Ruth had once known. Instead, in his eyes, there was weariness, loneliness, and something very close to regret. "Hello, Mrs. Carter," he began, his voice gentle but still clear. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Ruth studied him closely, nodding slightly in response. "I think it's time for us to have an honest conversation, Mr. Holt." Raymond slowly sat down across from Ruth, his gaze quietly drifting toward the window. They sat in silence for a long while, the sound of dry leaves rustling outside adding to the hesitation in his heart. Finally, Raymond spoke, his voice soft but heavy with weight. "Mrs. Carter, I've met Daniel. I've witnessed how he's grown with your support and through the Carter Community Foundation. I never imagined that Daniel could overcome such great obstacles in his life, and I never thought that you, the woman I once looked down on, the woman I tried to take advantage of, would become my son's greatest source of encouragement." Ruth remained silent, listening carefully to each word he spoke. Raymond's eyes now carried deep emotions and a sense of shame, something she had never seen in him before. She knew this was a moment of great significance for both of them, especially for the powerful but lonely man sitting before her. Raymond continued, his voice trembling with emotion. "I don't know where to begin. My whole life I believed that strength, power, and coldness were the most important things to survive and succeed. I always taught Daniel that emotions and compassion were weaknesses we had to abandon. But I was wrong, completely wrong. And the worst part is I didn't realize that until it was too late." Raymond lowered his head, his hands tightly intertwined as if searching for steadiness. Ruth remained quiet, understanding that he needed time to unburden himself. Finally, Raymond's deepest confession echoed through the air. "I am a failure as a father, Mrs. Carter. I have no excuses for my mistakes. I raised Daniel with such coldness and strictness, thinking it would make him stronger. But I was utterly wrong. Daniel became strong, not because of my heartless discipline, but because of the kindness, love, and support he found in you." Raymond's eyes were now filled with tears, a stark contrast to the hardened exterior he had always maintained. For the first time in his life, he felt helpless in the face of everything he had once believed in. Ruth looked at him with compassion, her voice soft and understanding. "Mr. Holt, we all make mistakes. What matters is not the past, but what you choose to do next. Daniel came to me, not to condemn you, but to help you find the best part of your heart. And I believe you can start over, if you truly want to." Raymond looked up, meeting Ruth's gaze. His eyes, no longer cold, were filled with deep sincerity. "Do you really think I still have a chance?" Ruth smiled gently, her voice reassuring and calm. "It's never too late to change, Mr. Holt, because kindness and goodness are always waiting for us to come back. Daniel is still waiting for his father, not a perfect father, but a father who acknowledges his mistakes and is willing to make amends." Raymond nodded silently, for the first time in many years feeling truly vulnerable, but it was a vulnerability that felt worthwhile. He understood that Ruth was right. This wasn't the time to cling to false pride. It was time to face himself, his mistakes, and the heart that he had locked away long ago. He stood up, extending his hand toward Ruth, his voice sincere and more emotional than ever. "Thank you, Mrs. Carter. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I promise that from this moment forward, I will live and act in a way that I won't regret." Ruth took his hand, her eyes glowing with genuine faith and hope. "I believe in you, Mr. Holt, because I know that deep within each person's heart, kindness never truly disappears. It just needs a chance to be awakened." Raymond stepped out of the cafe, his heart overflowing with a strange feeling he had never known before. For the first time in many years of living with power and coldness, he felt something new stirring within him. Hope. And he knew that the journey to fix his mistakes ahead would be long, but at least he would no longer walk it in solitude. Left alone in the small cafe, Ruth looked up at the fading sunset, smiling softly. She understood that from this day forward, the lives of herself, Raymond, and Daniel would be completely transformed, not by power or wealth, but by the magical strength of kindness and forgiveness that each of them deserved to receive. In the days following that heartfelt conversation, Raymond Holt seemed to have changed drastically. For the first time in his life, the man who had run Holt Dynamics with an iron fist and cold demeanor began to look inward, listen, and take small steps toward healing the wounds he had once caused. And with each step, he always remembered Ruth Carter, the humble woman who had performed a miracle through her genuine kindness and unwavering resolve. Daniel's graduation day took place on a sunny May morning. Hundreds of young students, dressed in dark blue graduation gowns, joyfully walked into the university campus. Among them, Daniel Holt stood out with a radiant smile and a mature confidence, something he had never had before. Daniel had not only overcome the physical limitations he had once endured, but he had also stepped beyond the invisible mental barriers his father had built for him since childhood. Ruth arrived early, standing in the corner of the campus, her eyes filled with pride as she watched Daniel. Memories flooded her mind like a slow-motion film. The cold, rainy night when she had seen Daniel shivering in his wheelchair, the moment she decided to step out and protect him, and all the days that followed when she patiently helped him overcome his insecurities, slowly rebuilding his confidence. Ruth never imagined that those small actions back then would lead to a special moment like this today. Suddenly, a familiar voice gently called out beside her, "Hello, Mrs. Carter. I hope I didn't startle you." Ruth turned and was surprised to see Raymond Holt standing there. For the first time, he wasn't wearing his cold, formal suit, but a lighter jacket, his face relaxed, and his eyes filled with genuine emotion. "Mr. Holt, you've made it," Ruth replied softly with a slight smile. "Daniel will be so happy to see you here." Raymond took a deep breath, his eyes gazing far into the distance. His voice was sincere as he spoke. "I owe Daniel a great deal, Mrs. Carter. But more than that, I owe you a sincere thank you. It was your kindness that saved my family, that saved me from the coldness and loneliness I had imposed on my life." Ruth smiled gently, her voice soft but profound. "We all owe each other something in this life, Mr. Holt. What matters is that we learn to let go of our pride and accept that none of us are perfect. I think today you've truly understood that." Raymond nodded in understanding. At that moment, the loudspeaker announced that the graduation ceremony was about to begin. The students were called one by one to the stage to receive their diplomas. When Daniel's name was called, the entire auditorium erupted in applause. Daniel slowly made his way to the podium, his gaze turning toward where Ruth and his father stood. Unexpectedly, Raymond stepped forward, moving toward Daniel, as the entire auditorium watched in surprise. He placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder and spoke clearly and powerfully to the hundreds of people listening. "Before Daniel receives his diploma today, I want to say a few words. I am Raymond Holt, a father who has made too many mistakes, and I want to publicly admit that here and now. For many years, I unintentionally pushed my son into deep pain because I believed that strength meant coldness and indifference, but I was completely wrong." The auditorium fell eerily silent. All eyes were on Raymond, the most powerful man in the city, standing there with humility, publicly admitting his own weaknesses for the first time. "I want to express my deepest gratitude to Mrs. Ruth Carter, who is standing across the hall," Raymond continued, his eyes lovingly directed toward Ruth. "It is Mrs. Carter's kindness and persistence that changed Daniel's life, changed my family, and awakened my heart. If it weren't for her, I might never have understood that true strength doesn't lie in power or wealth, but in compassion and love." The applause that followed was deafening. People stood, their eyes full of emotion as they turned toward Ruth. At that moment, Daniel stepped up beside his father, his face full of happiness and pride. He looked toward Mrs. Ruth and spoke sincerely. "Mrs. Ruth, I know that no words of thanks can ever express how grateful I am. I want you to understand that you didn't just save my small life. You helped my father find his heart again. My father and I will always be grateful to you." Amid the thunderous applause, Ruth stepped up to the podium with Raymond and Daniel. For the first time, the three of them stood together, representing a miraculous reconciliation between things once thought impossible. Rich and poor, power and simplicity, past and future. Raymond took Ruth and Daniel's hands, his eyes shining with newfound trust and sincerity. Ruth looked up at the clear blue sky, her heart overflowing with gratitude and fulfillment. She understood that the greatest thing in life isn't fame or wealth, but moments like this. Moments when people truly find each other, when forgiveness, kindness, and love become the only force strong enough to overcome all the limits of life. Since the day she stood on the graduation stage beside Daniel and Raymond, Ruth Carter's life had entered a new chapter, one filled with joy, tranquility, and, above all, a sense of fulfillment. For her, it was the greatest reward life had given after all the hardships and challenges she had overcome. But what was even more valuable was that the seeds of love and compassion she had sown long ago had truly sprouted, spreading and growing with each passing day and hour. The Carter Community Foundation continued to grow, becoming a home for thousands of impoverished workers, orphaned children, and families seeking a new light in life. Every day, Ruth still diligently went to the organization, always the first to arrive and the last to leave. Though age had etched deeper lines on her gentle face, her eyes remained bright and full of life, an affirmation that kindness and a loving heart never grow old. Daniel, now a grown man, was always by Ruth's side, supporting her in both large and small projects. Inspired by the passion of the woman he always called Grandma Ruth, Daniel became a new symbol for the younger generation, continuing to spread the spirit of compassion and community responsibility that she had worked so hard to nurture. One late autumn afternoon, bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun, Ruth sat on her usual bench outside the Carter Community Foundation. She gazed ahead, watching Daniel stand amidst a group of children, chatting and teaching them how to plant small seeds in their shared garden. The sight made her smile gently, her heart swelling with happiness and contentment. A familiar voice called from behind. "Mrs. Carter, are you sitting here again, watching the future?" She turned to see Raymond Holt walking over, sitting beside her, his gaze also directed toward Daniel. "Yes, Mr. Holt," Ruth replied softly, her voice calm and proud. "The future is beautiful when we know how to plant good things starting today." Raymond nodded in agreement, his face much softer than before. His voice was as light as a breeze. "You've changed my life, Ruth. But more importantly, you've helped Daniel find himself. I can never thank you enough." Ruth gently shook her head, offering a warm smile, her eyes still fixed on Daniel with all the love in her heart. "No, Mr. Holt, I haven't done anything other than help Daniel believe that he's always worthy of love and being heard. I believe that's something any of us can do, as long as we truly want to make a change." Raymond fell silent for a moment, then spoke softly. "Maybe you're right. It's strange, but I used to think power was everything, and now I understand that true strength lies in the simplest things, like love and kindness. You've taught me the greatest lesson of my life." Ruth placed her hand gently on Raymond's, her eyes glowing with deep faith. "Mr. Holt, my whole life has proven one thing. Love never grows old. No matter our age, whether rich or poor, powerful or powerless, we all have the ability to change the world around us with love and kindness. Many years passed, and Ruth gradually stepped back, handing over the responsibility of running the charity to Daniel. But she never stopped showing up at the Carter Community Foundation, for it had become an inseparable part of her life. Though age had slowed her steps, each time she entered the familiar room, she still felt her heart filled with strength and vitality. As the final days of her life approached, Ruth continued to live in profound peace. From the small room where she rested, she always looked out at the community garden of the foundation, where Daniel and many young people continued to plant the seeds of kindness she had left behind. One final afternoon, Daniel sat beside her, gently holding the hand of the woman he loved most in the world. His eyes were filled with emotion, his voice trembling slightly. "Grandma Ruth, do you know that you are the most beautiful thing that's ever happened in my life? I promise you, I'll always continue the things you've done. I'll never let the flame of love you lit go out." Ruth smiled softly, her hand trembling as it rested on Daniel's cheek, her eyes shining with happiness and contentment. "Do you know, Daniel, my greatest achievement in life isn't what I built, but seeing you grow up to be a good man, one full of compassion and responsibility. You are the greatest legacy I have." The day Ruth passed, the entire city mourned deeply and profoundly. But her departure wasn't an end. It marked the beginning of something much greater, the eternal and powerful spread of kindness and generosity. Thousands of people came to bid farewell to Ruth, not with sadness but with deep gratitude and a strong determination. They knew that she had never truly left them, for each heart she had touched would always hold a piece of her, a heart that never ages, forever young and full of loving strength. Ruth Carter's life is the most vivid proof of a very simple truth. A small act of kindness can change the world. Through her compassionate heart, resilience, and unwavering belief in the good, she ignited a light of hope, not only for Daniel and Raymond, but for thousands of others. And you, do you believe that a small act of kindness from you could bring about great changes? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. If this story has inspired and moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to spread these meaningful messages to more people. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in the next stories.